So, I've heard that loot boxes are a subject of concern these days, but be assured, or reassured rather, that they're not actually a big concern. They're never going to become popular, especially not with smaller studios. If you actually browse the internet, you'll find that only AAA games really have loot boxes in the first place, and secondarily, most AAA games don't have loot boxes, and so only a small subset of games have them. Hold on a second, let me just do this really quickly. And the purpose of loot boxes, you see, is to bring in more profit. And if the loot boxes are deprecating the quality of the game too much, then people won't even buy the game anymore in the first place, or even play it. And so, demand for the game goes down while the supply remains high, and the product becomes less valuable. And thus, it becomes illogical at that point to have them in the game in the first place. And these things are all accounted for by the big studios. They want to maximize profit. But of course, I'm sure there are many studios who don't think only about profit, but no matter who you're talking about, it's always the primary concern. Because without profit, how do you even survive as a studio? You don't, that's the answer. And so, and that's the abbreviation of the situation. You know, in the past, loot boxes were never a thing until I think sport games introduced them, or maybe it was online shooter games like Call of Duty. I don't remember exactly, but it was something like that. But ever since then, I think they've been a subject of concern. Look at this. Anyway, and it's been thought that the trend would continue from that and consume the markets, which I don't see that happening. You see, Always Online DRM was, I think, thought to be similar to that when it was first introduced, and even though it is still a concern, it's not going to spread very far. And it hasn't spread very far already, you can still see. Well, but that's only a fraction of the story. If a game has loot boxes in the first place, that's a good sign that you might not want to buy it to begin with. And because that shows potential anti-consumer practices, and I'm very against anti-consumer practices. Anti-consumer practices is completely counter to the idea of games to begin with in general. The purpose of a game is to benefit the consumer themselves. Well, for the studio, it's to make profit, but for the consumer, it's to benefit the consumer. And so, because of this, a balance must be made between the two in order for everything to function as a successful system. Which, loot boxes being a big problem, it would unbalance the whole system and force a sort of what would you call that? A rebalancing? Something would need to happen on the other end to rebalance the whole system so that it didn't collapse. And by that I mean if the quality of the game were to be diminished, the demand for it would be diminished. But usually, games like that don't last in the first place, and so they would be replaced with games that were good for the consumer. And so for a studio to survive, they would need to be very pro-consumer, but not so pro-consumer as to destroy their chances of getting any money. Although some studios have found tricks and ways around this in order to sort of squeeze more blood from the stone and get money that they probably shouldn't even have, because the quality of the game would be too low to reasonably warrant such payment. But of course, another thing to remember is that anti-consumer practices can only be kept secret for so long until they're found out. And when they are found out, the bubble bursts, and everything that they obtained through these subversive means is taken back away as it was meant to be in the first place. And so it's kind of like an artificial inflation, and these aren't very good for the industry, actually. But eventually, smart consumers do catch on to things like this and develop methods for rooting them out before they can happen. Because, of course, the consumer is still concerned with their own well-being, as the studio is concerned with its own well-being. And it's very unlikely that anything terribly bad can happen, other than perhaps, could you imagine a game that secretly had always online DRM, but didn't actually implement it until halfway through the game? Or, worse than that, a game that was released in early access, but was changed totally fundamentally from what it began as, so that the people who initially bought it have a completely different product now. Could you imagine how terrible that would be? Actually, that's pretty similar to how Rust happened. Rust was originally a game about zombies and surviving in an irradiated wasteland, but now it's a game about depravity and the Mad Max. But I think that's all I want to talk about that for right now.